Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley, and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I would like to welcome you to this workshop on assessment validation, which forms part of TAC's education program. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, which is the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now I would like to introduce Russell Docking, who is our presenter for today. Thank you very much, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mel, and may I say welcome everybody. It's really good to have you with us today, and thank you very much, Mel, for setting this up and all the work that you do to make these workshops run smoothly. It's very much appreciated. Assessment validation is the fourth in our sequence of 4 workshops, and in a sense, it bookends the workshop because we started off by talking about how you plan and design. We went through how you carry out assessment processes in terms of building assessment tools and using assessment tools. And now we're asking the obvious question, I guess, which is, are those assessment tools working? Are the way we're using them is that working effectively? And was our original planning good? So in that sense, this provides a form of closure, and indeed, as we get to the end of this session today, we'll turn right back to the beginning and remind ourselves about why all this effort is so important. Our workshop today is supported by all sorts of resources, and again, near the end, there'll be a slide which lists the resources you can access. But of course, there are the fact sheets that TAC produces. So the first one, of course, is on assessment generally, but there is also a specific TAC fact sheet dealing with assessment validation, and so what we're sharing with you today will be consistent with that. And finally, there is the pre-session reading, which you would have received as part of your invitation to participate in this session. I won't be working with that pre-session reading at all, other than a few slides where we make reference to the specific issues that are addressed in that pre-session reading. So there will be hooks between what we're doing today and that pre-session reading. So hopefully you've found the time to have a look at that. There's also, you'll find in the pre-session reading another list of resources which enable you to go to the TAC website and access those resources as we go. The subject, though, for today, of course, is validation. And it's logical for us to start with a discussion of the RTO standards and assessment validation, because assessment validation does figure significantly in the standards, both within the glossary and within the standards themselves. And the word valid and validation appears quite a number of times. And that is in part a reflection of the significance of assessment and the significance of making sure that assessment is good. It comes through the standards again and again. Then we'll move on and look at, just very briefly, the distinction between assessment validation and assessment moderation, because these are terms that are often used interchangeably, and yet they are actually quite different. And as our title suggests for today's workshop, our focus is on assessment validation, but we want to contrast that briefly with the idea of assessment moderation. Then we move to the actual processes of assessment validation and identify that we need to validate assessments before we use them, while we're using them, and after we've used them. So the pre-use, in-use, and post-use assessment validation gives us a structure for thinking about why they're important, how we do them, what to do with the outcomes of that information. And that leads us to that final point of, well, what can that assessment validation lead to? How can we use the findings of assessment validation? Because what we need, again, to think of this as a sort of circular process, that assessment validation is a strategy not just to pat ourselves on the back and say it's looking pretty good, but also to say these are things that we can improve so that our next cycle, if you like, of assessment is in fact going to work better. And the pre-reading, of course, talks about the need for high quality assessment practices, which strangely is also what we're going to end up with in our workshop today, and quality criteria for assessment. What is it that we need to be able to show is working well? And there is a small activity that looks at those quality criteria at the end of our session, where we'll be asking you to think about one or two particular criteria and what sort of validation process you might use to establish that you're meeting those quality criteria. Of course, the quality criteria, though, are spelt out in formal sense in the standards for RTOs. And so if we look at the standards for RTOs, we can see that there are some very specific clauses that talk about assessment validation. So 1.9 in the standards talks about the need for ongoing systematic validation of assessment practices and judgments. And notice that the term there is practices and judgments. And that is basically saying, is your assessment process working? Is your assessment system working? That is going beyond just, do you have good assessment tools? But it takes into consideration the question, are those tools being used properly? And are those tools leading to good quality judgments? And so standard 1.9 takes us beyond merely just are the rules of evidence being met and the principles of assessment being met. Those are characteristics of the tools. What we're now asking under 1.9 is it working as a system to lead to meaningful and credible judgments? Standard 1.10 reminds us that we need to validate every training product at least once every 5 years. And a training product there could be a standalone unit of competency, or it could be a qualification. And if it was a qualification, when we're validating the assessment processes within a qualification, we don't validate every unit of competency. We would validate a sample of units of competency in order to establish that what we were doing was legitimate. And through that process, we get a sense of whether or not we're delivering the training product and assessing the components of that training product effectively. And 111 points out that there needs to be an appropriately qualified and experienced team of people carrying out the validation. And in particular, in this case, because the person who is the assessor is being validated as well as the assessment system and tools, the person who is the assessor can't be part of that validation team. They'll contribute to the team, but they are the subject of validation. So there is quite a lot within standards 1.9, 1.10 and 1.11, and we'll touch on those issues as we go through our workshop today again. But it's important for you to get your head around those particular standards and what they require. 1.8 does not talk about validation, but it does talk about validity. And basically what it's saying under 1.8b is that there's a principle of assessment of validity. That is basically saying that judgments you make with your assessment tools need to be valid judgments, and that means they need to be a true reflection of the assessment requirements of the unit of competency. And a rule of evidence is validity. And that basically means that what you are actually gathering as evidence needs to be a valid reflection of the unit of competency's requirements. So although validation is not mentioned in 1.8, validity is. And for you to establish the validity, both in terms of a principle of assessment and as a rule of evidence, you need to validate your assessment tools as you develop them. And that, of course, really relates to pre-use validation. So we will touch on 1.8 when we look at pre-use validation. We will also look under 1.9, 1.10 and 1.11 at in-use validation and post-use validation. Standard 2 also reflects on this in a significant way. In particular, Standard 2 says under 2.1 that you need to establish that you are complying with the requirements of Standard 1. And so 2.1 says that you and anyone working with you in the delivery of training and assessment needs to comply with Standard 1. And of course, Standard 1 includes assessment and assessment validity. So we recognise under Standard 2 that it is referring to a form of validation. There is also validation, if you like, of other aspects of Standard 1, but our focus today is on assessment. And 2.2a and b talks about the need for you to gather evidence and systematically gather evidence that enables you to make judgments about the quality of your delivery of your training and assessment services. So that again touches on validation. And then 2.3 and 2.4 refer to your dealings with third parties who are delivering on your behalf. And under those circumstances, if they're conducting assessments on your behalf, then 2.3 says you have to have a written agreement to make sure that that process is effectively managed. And 2.4 says you need to monitor the quality of the services being provided by that third party, including, of course, assessment. And again, we find ourselves thinking about validation. So either directly or indirectly, the RTO standards provide us with strong messages about assessment and assessment validation. And we need to make sure that what we're dealing with today is consistent with those standards. Of course, you need to refer to those standards from time to time, and we will too. But there's also a guide that's been produced, a user's guide for the standards for RTOs, and I can refer you to that as well if there's extra information you want to pick up. It's commonly the practice for people to use assessment, validation, and assessment moderation as interchangeable terms. What we need to do here is to recognize that they are in fact quite different terms. Assessment moderation involves making adjustments either statistically or through assessment judgments where there are no specific outcome standards, process standards, or judgment standards against which to assess. And this is typical, if you like, in school education and in higher education, where there are no competency standards defined. And what you find there is that if you carry out an assessment, say an assessment of an essay that might have been written by a student, you'll find that assessors vary considerably in the judgments that they make. Indeed, when it comes to a marking of, say, students' essays in English, the variation can be quite extraordinary. And under those sort of circumstances, you would have to argue that there is a problem in assessment. It's seen as assessor variation, and that is because there isn't a defined set of standards as to what a good essay is. So what you do with assessment moderation is that you get a group of assessors and you try to converge on a consistent way of marking. And that is either done statistically by adjusting the marks given by each person, or through discussion about the criteria that are being used to make judgments. And through that process, you arrive at some agreed marking scheme, and hopefully that will reduce the variation between markers. And that is a problem that only arises when there are no actual standards. Indeed, what is happening in the process of assessment moderation is that you're trying to derive standards. The trouble is there that if you looked at this on a regional basis or a state-by-state basis, little panels of assessors might arrive at different decisions about what the standards should be. We are working with national standards, and we have a national system when it comes to VET. So we have national standards rather than standards being determined by little panels scattered around the countryside. And that means that we have a set of standards against which we can moderate and monitor and, most importantly, validate what we do. And that means that we can be involved in assessment validation, which is basically saying we know what the standards should be. They're written in the unit of competency. Are we complying with that standard? In other words, we don't have to work out what the standard is. We're told what the standard is. All we have to do is work out, are we as assessors complying with the standards as it's written? And in a sense, what's happened is that the moderation process has been moved back into the writing of the unit of competency itself. So when you're involved in developing a set of competency standards, you use an assessment moderation process, or at least a moderation process, to determine the standards. And when the standards are agreed, you write them down. They become the national standards, as in units of competency within training packages. And from there on, moderation is not needed, and in fact quite inappropriate, because the standard has already been set. All we need to now do is determine that we are complying with the standard as it's written. So assessment validation and assessment moderation are very, very different processes. And we will see that happening, moderation happening in universities and in schools, but we won't see it happening in VET because we have actual standards already written. The assessment validation itself is defined in the glossary, and the definition, it's reasonably adequate, but it does have a few sort of strange words in it. For example, it says validation is the quality review of the assessment process. That's good. Validation involves checking that the assessments, tools, and products are valid, reliable, sufficient, and current and authentic. Produce current and authentic evidence to enable reasonable judgments to be made as to whether the requirements of the training package or VET accredited course are met. The only problem I have with that phrase is the word reasonable judgments. We need something stronger than reasonable judgments. We want to have judgments that themselves are valid. So it seems to me that they should be valid judgment rather than reasonable judgments. I'm not entirely happy with the word reasonable. It's just a little bit soft and squishy. What we need is something stronger, because we want credible quality judgments to be made, not just reasonable ones. But then it goes on and says it includes reviewing a statistically valid sample of assessments. And we'll come back to that term, statistically valid sample, because that has led to quite a few headaches of assessments, and making recommendations for future improvements to the assessment tool, process, or outcomes, and acting upon such recommendations. And the rest of that sentence is really good, because it basically reminds us that the purpose of validation is not just to say, oh, there's a problem. It's to say, there's a problem, let's fix it. Or it's to say, there's a problem, could this problem be somewhere else in the system? In which case, let's find out. And if there are problems beyond the sample we looked at, let's fix those as well. So fundamentally, the definition is good, but we do need to be clear of the fact that it's not a reasonable judgment that we want to make. It's a precise, credible, and valid judgment that we need to make. To make that judgment, then we need to ask ourselves what criteria are involved. So if we look at this next slide, we can see that there is, in fact, a broad range of criteria that we need to consider when it comes to validation. Usually when I look at validation processes, people focus on the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And of course, that is important, but it's not enough. And I say it's not enough because that's already been established under Standard 1.8, that the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence have been met. So it's really, if that's all you look at, just a reflection on the design, in other words, the pre-use assessment. But assessment validation goes much beyond that, and so we need to look at the standards and see what they have to say about the quality of assessment. And first of all, of course, there's the definition of competency itself within the glossary. And the definition of competency in the glossary talks about all sorts of things like transfer, consistency. It does talk also about principles of assessment and rules of evidence, but it also talks about industry standards and performance and application, skills and knowledge. So when we look at the definition of competency, we see within it quite a few requirements about what competency is and therefore how it should be assessed. And so it becomes a legitimate target for assessment validation. Are we really assessing all the qualities of what it is to be competent? And we'll touch on that again at the end, because I use that as an illustration in the activity that we're going to deal with later on this morning. But then standard 1.1 to 1.4 talks about adequacy of resources and time. And so it's a legitimate question to ask as a part of our validation process: has there been adequate resources made available for assessment, and have sufficient time being made available? In other words, is the assessment process treated with sufficient significance to be able to make sure that there's enough time and enough resources to carry it through effectively? Is it something to which a commitment of resources and time has been made by the RTO? Standard 1.5 and 1.6 talk about industry relevance. Specifically talks about relevance and validity in relation to assessment, as well as, of course, training delivery. And so once again, we can ask ourselves the question when we look at the validating our assessment processes: are our assessment tools a reflection of industry practice? And are our judgments that we make with our assessment process making meaningful and providing meaningful information about the prospective performance of that student back in the world of industry? And so that becomes a criterion for validation. When we come to responsiveness to individual needs, standard 1.7 and in part 1.12, of course, talking about RPL, which is a response to the fact that the person may well have learned the skills beforehand and only needs to be assessed. But 1.7 talks specifically about individual needs, the identification and response to them. Are our assessment systems and our assessment tools responsive to individual differences? And that becomes a really critical component of assessment validation. And then, of course, there's standard 1.8, which talks about the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. Are the actual tools themselves meeting those principles and meeting those rules? But then we also need to ask about the credentials of assessors and observers. Standard 113 through to 120 talk about the qualifications and experience and background that assessors need to have to be able to design and utilize the outcomes of assessment, and of observers who are involved in gathering evidence between that process of development and judgment that is done by assessors. Are the properly credentialed people involved in designing, building, using, and making judgments when it comes to assessment? And finally, the work of the assessor and observers. It's not specifically mentioned within the context of the standards, but we, when it comes to assessment, need to know that the assessors and the observers are carrying out the work that is required to gather good evidence of competence and to make good judgments of competence. So it's not just good enough to say we have a system that is well designed. We want to be able to also say we have a system that is actually used properly and works properly. And all of those questions need to be framed within the context of the sort of phases, if you like, of assessment. So before we use assessment, we need to be confident that what we're using as assessment tools have been properly developed to meet the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. And I'll come back to that just in a moment. And then we have validation while the assessments are being used. So the question is, are they being utilized in a valid way? Are assessor instructions being followed? Are student instructions being followed? Or for that matter, are assessor instructions and student instructions adequate and appropriate? Those sorts of questions are questions we ask while we're watching assessment take place. And that also might reflect on the use of observation tools and record keeping and the like. And then there's post-use assessment validation, which particularly relates to clauses 1.9 through to 1.11. But inevitably, it's going to touch back again to 1.8. And we're asking the question there, well, overall, does the assessment process and the assessment tools lead to good judgments, and are those judgments consistent with what industry requires when it comes to graduating our students in the vet sector. So what I propose to do now is to look at each of those components separately. And we start quite logically with pre-use validation. And pre-use validation is basically asking a number of fairly straightforward questions. And this is often done and usually done prior to the actual implementation of the tools through meeting clause or standard 1.8. And so the first question is, do the assessment tools faithfully reflect the unit of competency requirements? That is basically asking that fundamental question of validity. Do the tools, can you map, for example, the tools unit requirements to the tools to establish firstly that every unit requirement is addressed somewhere, and that every aspect of an assessment tool belongs in the tool because it relates to an aspect of the unit. And we need to be careful that we don't have gaps in our tools, but we also need to be careful that our assessment tools are not measuring things that are not part of the unit of competency. That would also be a source of invalidity because it could ultimately lead to an invalid judgment. We need to make sure when we're developing our assessment tools and before we use them that we have suitable resources and accessible resources. That might mean going outside the RTO to the workplace to carry out assessments. And indeed, many units of competency these days are referring to the need to use actual workplaces to conduct assessments. And then we need to be confident that what our tools are doing is reflecting current industry practices. And here your industry skills, your current industry skills play a very important part, because if you yourself are not familiar with current industry practices, it's going to be difficult for you to know whether or not your assessment tools or the assessment tools that you've purchased are a faithful reflection of current industry practices. Never lose track of the fact that the purpose of the assessment is to make a prediction about this individual's readiness for industry. It's not a reflection of what you've taught them, it's a reflection of their industry readiness. And that means that you need to think not so much about where they've been, but where they're going. And therefore industry practice becomes really important. Then you need to ask yourself, has it responded reasonably to student needs? And I use the word reasonably there because there is that concept of reasonable adjustment where you can make adjustments to assessment tools, but they must be reasonable adjustments. And so you can't just change things to meet student needs if in fact that process invalidates the tool as a reflection of the unit of competency requirements. So responding to student needs as much as you can, but without damaging the integrity and the credibility of the assessment process as a prediction of competency and industry readiness. And then, of course, there are the two classics, which is meeting the rules of evidence of validity and sufficiency, and meeting the principles of assessment of validity and reliability. Those other things in there will come in as well. Of course, things like authenticity will be part of making sure that it's a face-to-face assessment process where it's necessary, and of currency, making sure that the evidence you're using is evidence of now and not some evidence of some distant past, and fairness and flexibility kick in as well. But the key thing when it comes to looking at the assessment tools is validity, and that's what I wanted to emphasize there. And ultimately, too, you need to establish that the actual tools themselves are built around and have utilized expertise both in industry itself, so that they're a faithful reflection of industry needs, and have used vet expertise to make sure that they meet quality standards in general terms across the requirements of vet. But you don't always necessarily build your own assessment tools. And so one of the things that we need to consider is, what do you do if you're using someone's tools that have been developed either by an industry body, or and indeed they may be industry approved or industry validated or industry preferred. But you can't assume if they have that kind of imprimatur, you can't assume that the tools are compliant with the standards. And indeed, it's somewhat embarrassing to be able to say that not infrequently do you find that these industry approved, validated or preferred tools quite frequently don't actually match the unit of competency. And indeed, it's alarming to see that sometimes the tools developed by the people who also develop the training package don't necessarily, or the training product, don't necessarily match the training product. And that's somewhat disturbing. When you hire a car, you are accountable to the law to check that the car is roadworthy. You can't just assume that because you've hired a car from a reputable hire car company that the car itself is roadworthy. If the car is not roadworthy and you drive it, that's your fault. That's your problem. And the same is true with assessment tools. You can't just assume that the assessment tools are ready to be used. You must check them to establish that they do comply, which does mean that you need to do a mapping. And that means that you need to establish that everything that the tool is supposed to measure is being measured. In other words, all the components in the previous slide that we talked about in terms of pre-use need to be applied by you to tools that either you developed yourself or that you borrowed or purchased from somebody else. And if there are some gaps, and it's not uncommon to find there are gaps, then you need to make sure that you supplement the assessment so that those gaps vanish. It's not good enough just to say, I found the gaps. You need to go on beyond that and say, and I've closed the gaps. Now, that may not mean that you can amend the tool. There might be copyright requirements that prevent you from actually amending the tool. What it would mean is that you would need to implement some supplementary assessment, some additional assessment, so that the process of assessment ultimately led to you making a safe and valid judgment. But the sort of problems we often find are failure to assess all the knowledge items, assessing performance requirements through knowledge questions, which of course is not telling you that the person can perform, only that they know how to perform. And sometimes you find that they don't meet the performance evidence requirements. So as the user of the tool, you need to make sure that you are actually using a tool that is fit for purpose. And if it's not, either abandon the tool and create your own, or modify the tool, not so much by changing itself, but by creating a supplementary or additional assessment for components so that you can make sure that there are no gaps and therefore no errors of judgment. The pre-assessment validation, though, requires that you to gather together appropriate information so that you can make a meaningful judgment about the validity of the tools, either purchased or your own. Obviously, the unit of competency and assessment requirements is the starting point, and you need to be able to examine what is required by the unit of competency and its assessment requirements closely, because you then need to be able to check off each of those requirements against the tools that you are going to use. You need to look at the training and assessment strategy document, because that will provide you with an understanding of how the assessment tools fit into the overall strategy of the organisation. And the learning and assessment plan will probably show you, if there is one, a learning and assessment plan, how the tools are sequenced in relation to the learning experiences of the students, because that again is part of the process of making sure that the assessment process is properly resourced with both time and resources and is sequenced in an appropriate way. An assessment mapping is a very good thing to do. It's not mandated, but it is something really good to do to establish the relationship between the requirements of the unit of competency and the assessment requirements and the assessment tools that you're using. It's good to have and to be able to look at the knowledge evidence tools and their marking guide. you need to ask yourself the question, are these knowledge tools actually pitched at the right level of sophistication? Does the marking guide provide a sufficient basis for the person who's looking at the student's answers or listening to the student's answers to make a reasonable judgment about whether or not what they're hearing or reading is good evidence of the presence of the knowledge. The same thing is true with skills assessment tools. You need to see how they're structured, excuse me, and how they provide guidance to the student and to the assessor, the observer. And you need to have a look at the observation guide to see if that provides adequate guidance to the observer in terms of being able to guide the way in which they record their observations, and again make judgments as to whether what they're observing is consistent with the requirements of the skills. And you need to look at the assessment summary. How is all of this evidence that's been gathered summarized to be able to make a judgment of whether a person is or is not competent? And separate to, but similar to all of the above, are your RPL processes and tools. They need to be looked at. They may well be the same assessment tools, or they may be separate tools, but also look at the RPL processes itself and ask, do these RPL processes optimize the chance of discovering what an individual's competencies and knowledge, or skills and knowledge, are, so that you can be confident that the RPL process is going to give you valid information. So you can see that there's a lot to get your head around in that process. And Standard 1.8 really picks up on most of this, because much of what we're talking about here are meeting the rules of evidence and the principles of assessment. But as you saw in an earlier slide, there are issues in terms of complying with the definition of competency, and issues relating to the way in which these tools are set up for subsequent use, and are they set up to be used effectively. So the process of pre-assessment validation is a significant one, but this can be done by the person who's designing the tools themselves. In other words, this does not have to be done by an independent validator. It's good if it can be, but it doesn't have to be, because what you're looking at is making a judgment, hopefully an objective judgment, about the quality of those tools. But when it comes to in-use validation, it's probably better to get someone else to look at what you're doing. Because when it comes to in-use validation, we're beginning to ask the question, well, if these tools are good, are they being well used? And so what you need to ask the question is, well, are we providing clear instructions to observers? Is it possibly they're not being well used, not so much because the observer is incompetent, but because what we've provided them with is inadequate instructions? It's not common to find this as a problem, but it can happen that there are important information the observer needs to know that hasn't been included in the instructions. One of the problems is that as experts, you know what you expect to happen, but you need to put that knowledge down in writing, because an observer may not know what you expect to happen. So your observer instructions can be there for yourself to remind you about what you want, but also if you're using a third party, another person as an observer, you need to be confident that what they're doing is acting according to your expectations. The clarity of learner instructions is also important. You need to be very confident that the learner is given adequate information to be able to prepare themselves for the assessment, either the knowledge assessment or the skills assessment that is about to follow. And that is really important, because all assessment is, to some extent, not so much a traumatic, but certainly a challenging experience. And so the learner needs to clearly understand what your expectations are, what they can do and what they can't do. So clarity of learner instructions is also something you pick up whilst you're watching the assessment process, in action. Then there's the fidelity of the administration of the tools. Okay, you've provided clear instructions for the observers and the learners, but are they actually being followed? So are the tools themselves being used according to your instructions? And that can be because sometimes there's a clash of roles. For example, in the workplace, a person may be simultaneously an assessor and a mentor, and might find it difficult to move from the mentor role, where they're the student's ally and friend, to the assessment role, because it's important there that what happens is that they set aside that mentoring role and become, if you like, slightly more severe in their orientation, because what they're doing now is not nurturing the student but assessing the student. And nurturing might follow the assessment, but during the assessment process there needs to be a kind of objectivity and disinterest that enables the tools to be administered properly. So you need to be confident that there is fidelity in the administration of the tools, that they're being used properly. Excuse me. And then you need to ask yourself the question, while you're watching assessments, are the recording methods adequate? We're seeing more and more these days people using tablets to record observations directly as they happen, but most of the time still it's paper and pencil. But the important thing here, to make sure that the assessment evidence is credible, is that these recording of results and observations is done contemporaneously, which means while it's happening, not on some sort of recollection after the event. So we need to be confident that the recording methods are being used properly and that they're suitable to be able to record events and outcomes and answers and activities as they happen. And finally, but not by any means the least important thing, is we need to ask ourselves, what's the impact on the learner of the assessment process? We want the assessment process to be constructive and supportive, so that the learner is able to demonstrate the qualities that they've acquired. But we don't need to raise the anxiety levels. It's already an aspect of anxiety in being assessed in the first place. What we need to do is to be confident that what we're getting from the learner is evidence of their true competence, that has not been mediated by fear or panic or anxiety. And so we need to think about the impact on the learner of the actual assessment processes we're using. And all of that comes back to that sort of notion that we are watching the assessment process to find out how well it's working as it happens. And so the sort of evidence that we'll be gathering are things that tell us whether or not the observer is complying with the administrative instructions, providing adequate time and resources. And indeed, I have seen in the past where quite often sort of leftover resources are used to save money, and it does make it difficult for the individual to demonstrate quality performance because they're not using materials or resources of the same standard that they would find in industry. That the process of assessment is responding appropriately to individual needs. And I guess I'm saying in that they're not inappropriately responding to individual needs. For example, not saying, oh, well, because the student has a difficulty, I'll provide some extra prompts. You have to keep on asking yourself the question, what would happen in the workplace? What would happen in industry? Would industry and the workplace provide these kinds of prompts? If not, then you can't do it. So the word appropriately becomes important, because we need to be confident that what we're getting is evidence that is a true reflection of their readiness for the world of work. And therefore, our response to individual needs to be appropriate and, dare I say it, reasonable. Then, of course, we need to be confident that the evidence gathering process is gathering evidence of authenticity and of currency. Are we actually seeing through this performance the right student performing the right stuff, or is it possible that we have an interloper, someone acting on behalf of the student? And that can be a problem when it comes to, say, online assessment, where we may not be able to see or know that the person answering the questions is indeed the student who's enrolled in our class. And then, of course, it needs to meet the principles of assessment of fairness and flexibility. Has our assessment process been adequately responsive to individuals so that we can be fair through being flexible? Always keeping in mind that the overriding principle is validity, but at the time we're observing evidence gathering is the time when we want to ask, are these tools being used fairly and flexibly? And then finally, is the assessor, the observer, suitably qualified to use the tools? Now, is the observer suitably qualified to use the tools is not talking about them necessarily meeting assessor qualifications. The assessor is needed to create the tools, and a qualified assessor is needed to make judgments on the basis of evidence from the tools. But to actually use the tools can be done by a range of different people. For example, a knowledge test could be delivered by an administrator who is simply administering the tool and not actually making any kind of judgments. What they're doing is administering the questions or the tests to the student and writing down the answers, but are not making any kinds of judgments because they may not be expert in the field, but they could be qualified in the sense to use the tools. In the case of observation, it's not necessary that the person be qualified as an assessor, but it would probably be necessary for them to be qualified in the vocational area. That is, they understand what the words in the checklist mean, so that they would need themselves to have expertise, vocational expertise, if not assessor expertise, to administer the tools. So that is always going to be a question that you need to ask. Is the observer suitably qualified to be able to make good use of the tools? And then we come finally to post-assessment validation. And when we start looking at post-assessment validation, we are now grabbing the whole picture, really, because we are going to touch again back onto the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, because post-assessment validation is now sort of, if you like, capturing the whole story. It is asking the question, how well does the assessor manage and monitor the observation process and the observers that they're using? Does the assessor, and through the assessment process, gather all the relevant evidence? If that evidence is being gathered through clustered assessment tools, is the evidence distributed from the clustered assessment tool to the appropriate units? Because at the end of the day, you do not make a judgment about whether a cluster has been achieved. You have to make judgments about whether each unit in the cluster has been achieved, which means if you are using an assessment tool that measures more than one unit, then you must at some point separate out the evidence and assign it to each of the separate units so you can make separate unit judgments. It's quite possible that an error made by the student will impact on one unit of competency, but not on the other unit of competency in the cluster. So the assessor, if they're using clustered assessment tools, needs to be able to distribute the evidence back to the tools that the units that the tools are measuring. They need also to make sure that all accepted evidence meets the rule of evidence. One, as we've talked about in the previous workshop, the first decision that an assessor has to make is this evidence that I've got before me credible? And that basically means that the assessor needs to make a judgment as to whether or not the rules of evidence are being met, so that the judgments can be based on quality evidence. And the assessor also needs to check that the assessment process overall is meeting those principles of validity, fairness, flexible, and reliability. And needs to make sure that the right expertise was used through the process of design and use of the assessment tool, and make sure that the evidence that is gathered together provides evidence of quality. So in post-assessment validation, we are now asking questions not so much about the assessment tools or the assessment process, but about the assessor. Did the assessor do his or her job properly? And these are the sorts of things that we could be looking at when we're looking at an assessor. What it means is that when we come to post-assessment validation, the assessor can't be the person doing the validation, because we are in actual fact validating the assessor, him or herself. If we look at clauses 1.9 through to 1.11, it tells us a lot about how this has to be done. So if we are validating the assessment tools, their use, and the assessor, and the outcomes of those tools, then we need to have a systematic plan. And so one of the first things we look for, we understand at 1.9, is that there is a systematic plan for actually gathering appropriate evidence. I have to say that quite often when I see that systematic plan, the actual target is tiny. So people sometimes just look at the principles of assessment, or just look at the rules of evidence, or even sometimes just look at the assessment requirements of a unit and not the rest of the unit of competency. Your systematic plan needs to be something that not only looks at the whole of the unit of competency, including the assessment requirements, also the whole of the assessment process from design through use, through judgment making at the end, and looks at everything around the assessment process, such as the assessors themselves and the evidence gatherers themselves. In other words, the plan needs to embrace much more than I often see, so that it actually gives us confidence that the whole system is working, not just the tools, or not just the assessors, or not just bits of the unit of competency. So the systematic plan is really important, that it embraces the whole range of things that need to be validated. And we would expect to see that in policies and in process. Then we need to see a validation schedule. Where something is high risk, we need to see it validated more often. But we need to be able to know that every training product that is delivered by the RTO is validated at least once every 5 years. And the word "at least" again reminds us that something that is high risk, or where there have been some issues or problems, maybe there have been some complaints, or there's been some uncertainty, or there's been rapid change in the industry, we may need to validate more often than once in every 5 years. So we need to see a validation schedule which is sensitive to the risks, if you like, either of the intrinsic risks of the unit, or the risks that arise from rapid industry change, or risks that have been identified through complaints or appeals. Those sorts of things need to inform the validation schedule, so that you can be confident that what you're working with is assessment tools and processes and people who are going to provide you with good quality outcomes and good quality judgments. The plan also, or the standards also, require that properly qualified and independent people are involved. Now, the word independent here means that other people from your RTO can be involved. In other words, you can have one assessor validating another assessor, but you can't have an assessor validating him or herself. It is important, though, to understand that if you're delivering in the area of training and assessment, that is, you're delivering TAE qualifications, the word independent now means someone from outside the RTO. So the word independent for most training products means someone other than the assessor, but when it comes to the TAE, it means someone outside the RTO. So the word independent has slightly stronger terminology. And if you look at the standards for RTOs, you'll see that in later clauses 121 through to 124 and 25, it talks about the need for an independent validator when it comes to those that lies outside the RTO. You also need to know that the personnel involved are qualified. That is, they bring either individually or as a group all of the qualities of standard 113. They have vocational competence, they have industry currency, they have vet skills and knowledge, and of course standard 114 or 115, where they are TAE qualified. Now that is not necessarily each individual, but as a panel, you need to be confident that they have collectively that set of qualifications. You need to know that there is a representative sample of work that has been reviewed. And on the next slide, we'll talk a bit about that because things have run amok a bit when it comes to that. But a representative sample of student work is needed so that you can be confident that you have seen all the different kinds of influences that might impact on the quality of assessment. You need to be confident that and need to be able to see how the outcomes of the validation process are documented, and then how the outcomes of the validation process are actually used or actioned. And I've used the word here, localized and institutional. I was searching for the right words here, but the action might be localized in the sense we've found this problem with these assessment tools, let's fix these assessment tools. But by institutional, I mean, you need to ask the question, could this problem be elsewhere in this training product? In other words, if you saw it in a particular unit of competency from a particular qualification, could this problem be more widespread? And could I find this problem in other units in this qualification? Or indeed, could this problem be spread beyond this training product and be a part of the institution? And it's not uncommon to find that there's a policy or a particular format of a document that creates an institutional problem, creates, if you like, an invalidity because it's been washed across the whole organisation and everybody is doing the wrong thing because everybody is following the institution's instructions, which have within them some kind of flaw. So when it comes to action, it's not just fix up the problem that you saw, but then ask yourself the question, could this problem be more widespread, either within the industry area and other training products within the industry area, or even across all the industry areas that our organisation delivers? And that is something we need to see. So clauses 1.9 through to 1.11 tell us a lot about what's needed in order to make sure that this validation process leads to meaningful judgments about the assessment system and the tools and the people, and leads to action either directly associated with what we've seen, but going beyond that to the broader work of the RTO. But I did indicate that the sample of student work can be a problem and things have run a bit amok there. And the reason is that the language of the standards, and including in the glossary, have led us a little bit down a troublesome path. And if we start talking about a random sample of appropriate size to enable confidence that the result is sufficiently accurate to be accepted as a representative of the total population of assessments, if you've got a small group of maybe 20 students, the random sample will probably be about 18 of the 20 in order to achieve a level of confidence. And that is disturbing because in effect you have to almost repeat all the assessments again in order to establish that there is consistency and quality in the process. And that has led to a lot of heartache in RTOs. What we're recommending here is that you use what's called a stratified random sample. And that basically says The reason that the sample taken from a group of students is going to be huge is because that random sample has got to be big enough to cover all the different kind of variations that might exist within the sample. So if we know what those variations might be beforehand, we can identify groups of people that belongs to different strata, different kinds of groups, and then sample very small samples from those groups. So, for example, you might well, in this set of assessments, we've used different assessors. Let's separate out those assessed by Assessor A from those from Assessor B, and just take a couple of students from Assessor A and a couple of students from Assessor B. That way we have covered the variation that might have been caused by assessors. Or there might be some people who are assessed by RPL. So let's take that group of RPL and just take a couple of examples from RPL. Or it could be that we have assessments happening in different campuses. Okay, so let's just take a couple from that campus and a couple from that campus. Or there could be some that are being assessed remotely. Okay, let's just take a couple from them. Now you have to basically ask yourself the question, what are the differences in the cohorts that are likely to impact on assessment? And there may be other things like gender that doesn't have an impact on assessment, in which case you wouldn't sample by gender. You would only sample by those things where you suspect there could be an assessment variation. So in many cases, you will just take 2 students overall. But if there are distinct cohorts that could have different kinds of variations, you would take a couple of students from each cohort and then look at those and see if there are any issues. Those can be randomly selected, so you haven't targeted some particularly juicy or good or troublesome students, but you randomly select the students from each cohort, but you've identified through stratified random sampling what are the cohorts, or stratified sampling what are the cohorts, and that way you can reduce what might have been a huge sample down to one that's really quite manageable. I do have that little note though at the bottom which says if you find that there are problems, then you might want to say, well, we need to sample a bit more to see if this problem really is widespread, or we've just happened to hit on a couple of bad examples. But the task of selecting your students for review need not lead to a monstrous group, a huge sample. It can be quite targeted by first stratifying the sample, the student group, and then selecting a small number of students from each strata. There's more information about that in the assessment validation fact sheet, but the purpose of that exercise is to make sure that you do get a statistically valid sample, as is required by the standards. But that's not a simple random sample, but a stratified random sample will mean that the appropriate size can be much smaller and much better targeted. And in that way, this validation process does not become a monster that it begins to interfere with all the other important work you do as an RTO. Now, all of this information needs at some stage or other to be pulled together as part of your organisation's standard quality assurance processes. And so what we need to do is to make sure that what we're building here is good quality evidence that will then feed into our quality assurance process. So with the kind of evidence that we're going to gather for this validation, firstly are the credentials of assessors. And indeed, maybe we should have also added there the credentials of observers. But we need to be confident that that we are using qualified assessors to make the judgments that we're making, and we're using qualified observers, people who are appropriately qualified to perform the observation task. We need to then make sure that there is analysis of the assessment tools themselves. And documented analysis of assessment tools really means that sort of preliminary work that is done in terms such as a mapping of the tools against the unit of competency, a review of the rules of evidence in relation to the assessment tools, and a review of the principles of assessment and how they are reflected in the assessment tools. But then we need to gather evidence of observation of the use of assessment tools. So when you're validating a particular collection of assessment tools or a particular training product, you need to spend some time watching how the tools are being used. And you may actually get that information back through student feedback, which is further down on the page, where candidates might be asked to comment on the use of assessment tools, but there might also be formal evidence, including appeals and complaints made by candidates, which is also information that you would use to make a judgment about the quality of your assessment processes. You need to make sure that a particular representative sample, we've talked about that in the previous slide, of student evidence is used to, if you like, follow the narrative from the evidence gathering to the management of the evidence through to the judgment that is being made of whether or not an individual is competent. And what we need to feel confident about there, that is that process has been managed in a way which preserves the integrity of the evidence that's been gathered. And we may even at that point start asking questions about authenticity. If assessment was happening online, how has that been authenticated? How has it been established that this evidence can be trusted so that it can be used to make a judgment of whether a person is or is not competent? We may get feedback from observers who have actually been using the assessment tools, and we may get feedback from candidates, as I've said before, having been through the experience of being assessed by those assessment tools. And we also might need to look at reassessment and comparative analysis. Now, what that is basically saying, when we look at this sample of student evidence, are we getting similar information from similar units of competency? Or where there's been reassessment done, or even if we are a bit concerned we might carry out a reassessment, is there consistency between the first assessment and the reassessment? Is there consistency in student performance across a number of assessments? Is there consistency in student performance across a number of units? Those sorts of questions will give us either confidence that what we're doing is the right thing, or will raise a flag which says, hey, there's something weird happening here. They've done really well in that unit, but badly in this one. Could it be that they've been well assessed in one and not so well assessed in the other? It's not going to answer the question. You're going to have to dig into the data. You're going to have to dig into evidence to find out what the answer to that is. But it can raise a flag which says there could be something weird happening here in the assessment process because the student's performance has been comparatively so different, either within the unit of competency performance or across a number of different units. All that information is either going to give you confidence that things are going well, or raise a warning that things might not be going so well and you need to do some more digging. Finally, you can also follow up your graduates. And not in all cases, but in some cases you have the opportunity to meet your graduates again. You could do it through graduate surveys, of course. But the fundamental question that needs to be asked is, were your assessments a good predictor of that person's ability to operate within the workplace? I mean, at the end of the day, that is a fundamental requirement and expectation of you as an organisation, that you are preparing people for the world of work. Your assessment tools are a way of determining whether the person is ready for the world of work. So were those assessments good? One way of answering that is talking to your graduates. And you can also talk to the employers of your graduates and from industry itself. Ask industry, how well are our graduates working? How well are our assessment tools, if you like, working as predictors of subsequent industry performance? And of course, there's TAC and ASQA providing feedback directly too. Now, TAC and ASQA are going to be looking very much at rules of evidence and principles of assessment. They may have the opportunity to look at assessment in progress. They may well have the opportunity to look at your assessment system holistically across a range of developments. And indeed, it's not uncommon for us to look at student files to see what the narrative is from initial enrollment through engagement in learning through assessment processes and ultimately certification. We want to see how that narrative is continuous and harmonious and provides a proper story telling us that you as an RTO have gone through this process in a way which leads to meaningful and consistent certification at the end. But what really is best is the work you do as an RTO yourselves in monitoring what you're doing, because you're there, because you are deeply engaged in the process. You're there all the time monitoring the way things are going. The best validators are always going to be yourselves. And that means that you need systems that feed strongly into your quality assurance process. And so Standard 2, which talks about your quality assurance processes, specifically refers to the need for you to make sure, firstly, in Standard 2.1, that Standard 1 is met. And Standard 1, of course, embraces clauses 1.8 through to 1.11. That is assessment design and assessment use and validation. But also under Standard 2.2a, it talks about systematic monitoring of training and assessment strategies. We're really just talking, of course, about assessment strategies today. And so 2.2a is saying, do you have that process going? But then it goes on and talks about evaluating and improving training and assessment strategies. In our case, again, we're focusing on assessment. So are you under Standard 2.2 evaluating and improving your strategies? And also in Standard 2, it talks about assessment services being delivered by a third party. Now here we're not talking about the person who's acting as your observer. Here we're talking about another legal entity that is carrying out assessments on your behalf. And that needs to be addressed in by Standard 2.3 in making sure that there is a contractual understanding about the way in which assessment tools are developed and used and the way judgments are being made. And Standard 2.4 is saying, and you need to monitor the quality of those services, because at the end of the day, you are going to be certificating students on the basis of judgments provided by that third party, and you need to know that those judgments are based on assessments that have provided you with quality evidence. So what we'd like to do now is to just give, we're going to take about 10 minutes just to have a little look at an activity. And you have an activity sheet, which we've asked you to print out, and we're going to refer to that now. But I'm just picking up from Mark Martin, how to encourage RTO to engage in non-profitable graduate follow-up. I'm not exactly sure what that means. So maybe, Mark, you might want to spread that question a bit more, or make that question a bit more explicit for me. But in the meantime, let's have a look at the activity. And what I have on this particular page is the top column of the activity, and I'll just like to walk you through so that you, when we set aside the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like you to have a look at one of the remaining benchmarks. The first benchmark you might remember from an early slide was the definition of competency. And the definition of competency talks about consistency, application, knowledge, skills, workplace standards, and transfer to new situations. So it's a requirement of our assessments that we are able to make judgments about consistency. It's a requirement of our assessments that we are assessing application, and we are going to be assessing the application of knowledge and the application of skills. And that all of this has to be to the workplace standard. And ultimately, we need to know, if we're looking at the definition of competency, that we're assessing a person's ability to transfer to new situations. So when it comes to sources of evidence, we want to find out whether our assessment strategy, our assessment system, is looking for consistency, application, knowledge, skills, workplace standards, and transfer to new situations. We may look for example assessment mapping. We may look at the assessment tools. We may look at the level of industry engagement in the construction of those tools. We may look at employer feedback. These are the sorts of things we might look for to find out whether or not we've met these assessment requirements. So there are lots of potential problems. One of them, when it comes to, say, consistency, is that we may have just done a one-shot assessment. If we've done a one-shot assessment of the elements of competency, we do not know if there's consistency. We might find that there's been repeated situations where, although there have been multiple assessments, they've been of the same thing, which does not tell us about transfer. We may have used an artificial context for assessment, a simulation, for example, that does not reflect the workplace standards. We may not have assessed skills because we may have actually assessed knowledge and thought that we're measuring the skills, or we may have fragmented the elements. We may not have measured the actual elements, but just measured the performance criteria in a fragmented way so that we did not know whether all of those performance components fit together to make up an element. So these are just some illustrations of the sorts of problems we might have in meeting the definition of competency. So we have to think of remedies. Well, for a start, at least 2 measures for each element in a different context and resources. If we have 2 measures, we can look for consistency. If we have different contexts and resources, we can look for transfer. So we can say, well, what we need to do is move from a one-shot assessment to 2 assessment measures so that we are actually able to know that we have achieved transfer and consistency. We might use observation for elements of performance evidence so that we are making sure that we are not thinking that knowledge is a substitute for skills and that we are using observation of actual performance. Although it's not shown here as a dot point, we might actually make sure that observation is done in an industry-like environment, either within the real workplace or within a really good simulation of the environment that meets the dimensions of competency. And in order to deal with fragmented elements, we might need to make sure that every time we ask a person to perform a task, that we are seeing or are able to see all the performance criteria for each element in that task. And in that way, we have made sure that we've not fragmented the elements. So what we see there is a benchmark, which is the definition of competency. What are the requirements of the benchmark? Where we can get evidence of whether the requirements have been met. What sort of problems might arise, although you might predict them in this activity. In real life, this is the point at which you would discover them as situations through the validation process, and then what sort of remedies you might have. So what I'm asking you to do is to look at the remaining components of this document, and so you'll see that there's sufficient and appropriate resources and time. What are the assessment requirements? So what constitutes sufficient and appropriate resources and time? How would you find out? What sort of problems might you have? And what sort of solutions might you need to implement? So what we'd like you to do is just to pick one of these and just fill out the row, and we'll reconvene at 11:26 when you've had a chance to give some thought to these. Thank you very much. We'll see you in a moment. Welcome back, everybody. Really good to see some responses there. Thank you very much, Campbell. You comment on the correct use of tools by observers, and you then say you need to have an appropriate checklist or marking panel, such as an assessor observation checklist. You need to have appropriate documents from the performance evidences from training.gov, and problems could be in the consistency or flexibility. Remedies could have some common issue examples with fixes. And what I'm seeing there, Campbell, is you're giving thought to where the issues could arise and what is required under the correct use of tools by examiners or observers. We're also getting some useful feedback, for example, from Amanda. What are the needs of the learner? Is assessment a simulation or on the job? Is there equipment required? What does industry need from students, and so on? What we're seeing here is you're giving a lot of really good thought to how you can go from the benchmark. And I failed to remind you that the benchmark, or I failed to comment on the fact that the benchmarks are taken directly from the pre-session reading. So there's some hints, of course, in there that each benchmark has within it some implicit and sometimes explicit requirements for assessment, and you're picking that up beautifully. That in each of those different examples, you'll need to go to different resources for evidence, either the student or the observer or the documentation or whatever, and you've identified potential problems, although in real life, in a validation process, you would be looking for real problems as distinct from potential problems, but it doesn't hurt to have in your mind what you should be looking for as a problem. And then, of course, for each problem that is identified, you need to have remedies. And I'm seeing from the comments that people are providing here that you've given it really good thought. So thank you very much to each of you. We'll just finish up with a couple of slides, if I may. And the first is to say, well, it's obvious that assessment validation might, in some circumstances, lead to just patting yourself on the back that you've really done a good job. But you might also find some problems, and where there are problems, you need to make changes. And those changes might be to the assessment strategies and tools. Or you might make changes to who you use as assessors and observers. Or there might be changes in how you manage the assessment process broadly. Or you may have to make changes in how the tools are used or how the assessment judgment process is managed. You may need to change your training and assessment strategy so that there is closer integration between what you're doing within assessment, what is happening within training, and what strategies you're using across the board. And you might also need to change your learning and assessment plan so that you are going to get better quality assessment. And there can be implications for other assessors, other training products, RTO systems, procedures and policies. So you need to go beyond just what you've looked at, but also look more broadly across your organisation to find out whether or not the issues you've found also mean that there are changes that need to be made there. And you might need to participate or arrange for people to participate or set up professional development programs if you find that there are endemic issues that need to be addressed. What you can't do with assessment validation is validate the actual standards themselves. The assessment standards, as units of competency and so on, are not subject to validation. They are the basis for validation, but you're not validating them. So it really is important that you understand that those are fixed benchmarks and that what you're doing is validating your compliance and your consistency with those benchmarks that are set. And so it is a little bit easy for you to say, well, the standards are wrong. What we have to be able to say is what we're doing needs to be consistent with those standards. We're not making judgments about the standards. So if I can close this workshop, and I know I've got run over time just briefly, is just to remind you back to one of the very first slides that we had in this series. And may I say to those of you who have managed to survive all 4 sessions, you've done a brilliant job. Thank you very much for your participation. But you might remember we started off with this. The core business of an RTO is the certification of industry relevant competencies of individual candidates. And that certification must be based on a judgment of competency made by a qualified assessor. And this judgment must be valid, reliable, fair and flexible as a judgment based on evidence that itself is gathered through assessment tools that are valid, sufficient, current and authentic. And that you are ultimately, as an assessor and the RTO as an organisation, are accountable for the validity of these judgments. If you've had a chance to work through these 4 sessions and the resources that TAC provides in terms of fact sheets and guidance, and of course through webinars such as this, then hopefully what you've been able to do is to meet this core business responsibility and this accountability through your assessment processes. And we just need to remind you that there are references and resources that you can access, including, of course, there are, of course, workshops and webinars and podcasts. And also need to remind you that if you have any further questions, then there's a brilliant team at TAC in the TAC office who can take your comments. Thank you very much for your participation. All the best with your assessment strategies. And thank you very much, Mel, for all your work in setting these up.